Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. This episode sees the return of a guest who's been on the show twice before. Professor Elizabeth Sheedy is a risk governance expert based in the Department of Applied Finance of Macquarie Business School in Sydney. On her last appearance, we explored how accountability regimes, that's where regulators hold senior individuals personally accountable for what happens in their firms, can help manage human risk. When she first appeared on the show last year, we looked at behaviour in banking and discussed why people in that industry do bad things. There are links to both of those episodes in the show notes. Elizabeth is back on the show for a third time because she's just published a book called Risk Governance, Biases, Blindspots and Bonuses. 3 Bs that have led to numerous risk management disasters. And in the book, she looks at how those factors influence decision-making and what we can do to mitigate them. In other words, it's a guide to managing human risk. In our discussion, we also talk about a second book that Elizabeth has co-authored called Auditing Risk Culture, a Practical Guide. Although it's obviously targeted at auditors, it's relevant to anyone looking at the subject of risk culture. And the best bit is that you can download it for free. There's a link to that in the show notes. If you heard her previous appearances, and if you haven't, I strongly recommend you listen to them. You'll know that Elizabeth is insightful, fun to talk to, and has some great stories to tell. So please enjoy my conversation with Professor Elizabeth Sheedy on risk governance, biases, blind spots, and bonuses. Elizabeth, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you for having me. I feel so honoured to be having a third go at this. It's really wonderful.
Well, I'm thrilled that you're back. And one of the reasons we got you back, apart from the fact that you're a great conversationalist, have some amazing insights, is you've been quite busy writing one book and contributing to another one. And I wanted to talk to you about how did the book on risk governance come about?
Yeah, so look, part of it's a COVID exercise, a COVID project. So I think you'll find round about now there are a lot of books coming out of projects that got going during the lockdowns of last year, and mine certainly falls into that category. So I found myself a little bit of open time, and certainly a lot more thinking about risk with a pandemic raging. So that was part of it. But it was also motivated just by my teaching. Okay, so I teach students in MBA programs. I teach in Master of Applied Finance programs. I'm teaching courses about risk management and governance. And for a long time, I've just been frustrated by not having a good text, good resources to direct students. And so I thought, well, look, may as well.
Only one thing for it.
That's right. So that was part of it, and I do feel very strongly that there is a real problem of lack of capability in industry generally in this area. So it's not just my students that perhaps need more resourcing. I think there are a lot of directors that are somewhat at a loss. So risk governance is one of these major trends in governance of this century. And yet many directors, they have these quite onerous responsibilities, but they perhaps are fairly new to the topic and, perhaps feel a little bit ill at ease. So I'm hoping that it could be useful for some directors and executives out there, as well as some students.
One of the things I find fascinating is when you look at the idea of managing risk, we all do it intuitively on a daily basis. So it's something that to navigate the world that we live in, and even pre-COVID we were doing it, but we're particularly doing it now under COVID and having to think about these sorts of topics. And so on the one hand, you've got a natural talent that we have because we wouldn't be here as a species or indeed probably as individuals if we didn't have some ability to manage risk.
Yeah.
And yet, when we find ourselves, particularly in corporate structures, but in sort of within organizations and roles, we struggle a little bit with it. And it doesn't seem to come naturally. I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
So yes, so we all have to do risk management. We make day-to-day decisions all the time that involve risk-return trade-offs. But a lot of us do a pretty poor job at it. The risks that are quite urgent and obvious, we're much better at. But risks that are more ambiguous or longer term, yeah, it's much tougher. And one of the big themes in my book is looking at a lot of the well-known human biases that relate specifically to risk management, and look at risk governance as a possible partial solution. Okay, I mean, in one sense, you can never completely resolve these biases. I mean, I think they come about. It's probably going to take another couple of million years of evolution for our brains to really completely sort ourselves out there. But so what do you do in the short term? Well, I think governance has potential to help some of these biases, like availability bias and short-term bias, because while it's very difficult to see these flaws in your own thinking, it's actually much easier to see them in others. Okay. And so that's, I think, where risk governance, if it's done well, can play a role, okay? Because you've got more like independent observers who are looking on and saying, have you thought about this? Or you sure you're not being blinded by your own incentives there? That looks a little bit self-serving to me. Maybe there's another way to think about that. If you think about a lot of these structures of risk governance, they can help to resolve some of these problems. So other people can help us to see those biases. I mean, risk governance does slow decision making down, and that can really frustrate people at times. I get that. But on the other hand, sometimes that's really necessary for risk management, because we really need to stop and think. It's when we rush that we often make the most mistakes in terms of risk management. And stopping to think, it's actually can be very healthy, and can limit some of the big mistakes. So so that's how I'm increasingly seeing risk governance as, that's why the book's called Risk Governance, Biases, Blindspots and Bonuses. So I think to me that's, I love a little bit of alliteration, and to me that kind of really hits the nail on the head of what it's all about.
When we look at the structures that we've built within organizations, particularly within companies, but you can see the same thing within governments and other institutions. I mean, in many respects, it seems to me that we have designed things that make this a lot harder. Mm. So we try to build consensus. We have structures that meet the way our meetings are run, where we sort of have to have agreement. People's voices are not necessarily, sometimes deliberately, sometimes just it happens as a result of the culture. Voices are silenced. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these things that you're talking about, the sort of Mother Nature's gift, if you like, from a risk management perspective, in the way that we have designed, and you talk about bonuses, so incentives, the way that we've designed structures, the roles that we've given people, we seem to have built a lot of architecture that makes this a lot harder. And in many respects, it's sort of anti-risk in terms of how it's been built. Not necessarily deliberately, but...
Well, there's pros and cons, don't you think? You think about a board of directors, and then within that, you've got your various committees. So in the one sense, having groups of people, you've got, that gives you the huge advantage of, diversity of perspectives. But I on the other hand, it also creates an opportunity for groupthink. Okay, so I guess it's it's a question of trying to get the best outcomes from those structures that we can, trying to leverage the positive and offset some of those negatives, and the more that we're aware of what some of those negatives can be, that does give you some power to address the problems. One of the big problems of boards that I see is that there's arguably too much laziness. Okay, and that's your classic sort of free rider problem. I think there are a lot of directors that take on too many directorships, and really doing a good job of it is it's a very demanding role. Taking that job really seriously. And challenging the executive in the way that you're supposed to, and really getting involved in some of those strategic decisions. It's a massive responsibility. I think one of the things that I enjoyed about writing the book, I challenged myself to include a chapter on strategic risk, because I think in my past teaching I haven't paid enough attention to strategic risk, and obviously that's to a large extent that's the main game. Okay, that's for a board, getting the strategy right and really thinking about the risks involved in that. That's one of the biggest challenges. If you think about some of the big issues that confront our society, like climate change, the massive trends we see in what else? Cyber risk would be another example. But just big changes in the way business is done. They're just society is going through massive changes, partly because of the pandemic, but there's even in the background, there's other stuff going on, and how an organisation can try and figure out what's an appropriate strategy given all of that complexity. To me, that's one of the biggest challenges anyone could ever face.
And one of the things that strikes me when you look at sort of strategic risk or senior level blind spots is that we have a natural tendency to equate experience with, we endow it with value. And so we say someone has lots of experience at something, therefore they know what they're doing. And of course that is correct in many contexts. But as I look at many of the challenges that we're facing nowadays, and as you say, whether that's to do with the environment, ESG would be a good sort of, it's a simple byword for all these challenges, but whether we're looking at the environment, or whether we're looking at social trends or technology, lots of things are not the way they have been before. We as humans are driving lots of change, but then there's lots of change being forced on us, meaning that a lot of the experience that one might have in the past isn't necessarily valid for dealing with the future. So I talk a lot about a slightly older version of me sitting in a boardroom, having zero comprehension as to what it's like to be a black female, the difference between digital immigrants and digital natives. And so the things that might have propelled you to that senior level, and often, of course, there's political skills that don't necessarily lend themselves well to the leadership skills. But it seems to me that's one of the big challenges here, is that we may not necessarily have people with the right skills in those positions, making a challenge that's already quite difficult even harder.
Yep, that's very true. And they're just breaking through the issue. Apathy and overconfidence. The biggest enemies of good risk governance, and breaking through that and getting people to really imagine future scenarios that are quite different from what currently exists is really quite difficult. But there's some people doing some good work looking at these problems. The way there's people doing interesting stuff in terms of wargaming, future scenarios. The crucial thing is you've actually got to get people to immerse themselves in that possible scenario to kind of really make it salient and to help them think through, what would that actually mean for us? If XYZ happened, what are the implications of that? And when people go through one of those wargaming exercises, that can really help them to break free of some of their old thinking paradigms. And I think we are in a bit special point in history where, because of the pandemic experience that we're all experiencing or have experienced, I think people are a little bit more open to thinking about, what if this, unusual but not implausible event happens. Okay, it's a unique point in time, and I expect it won't last forever, but I think for a few years we've got this wonderful opportunity to really tackle some of the big challenges. I can see a huge difference in the way a lot of executives here in Australia are thinking about climate risk now. And I think in a way it's related to the pandemic experience. And a whole lot of it's made, what the pandemic has done is really sheet home the point that sometimes the world can change on a dime.
So this is the sort of equivalent of I've recently been involved or seen a car accident, and I'm driving that little bit more carefully. We've got that moment where the idea that predictability and past experience is valuable has actually it's very salient to us now, is your point, and therefore we've got a fresh opportunity to really drive this home.
So anyway, let's see if we can make the most of it.
And look, you're coming back to your 3 Bs. The third one is bonuses, which is clearly is broader than just the idea of bonus, but it's incentivization. I'm fascinated by your thoughts on that, because it occurs to me we've got lots of things going on that are unhelpful from a risk governance perspective. So, and again, a construct that in theory is designed to produce good outcomes. So we incentivize people, we pay them bonuses to get the outcomes we're looking for. But in many cases, those things are terribly designed. And I would throw in things like quarterly reporting that also encourage short-term thinking. So again, we seem to have built some constructs that actually take something that on the face of it is designed to promote the right outcomes. But actually from a risk management perspective, and banking would be the obvious example where bonuses have driven interesting decision making. What are your thoughts on that? How do we manage that?
So look, executive remuneration is it's a hugely contested area in the academic literature. Okay, so there's a lot that has been written on that topic, and there's a few different schools of thought on it. But I think we're increasingly starting to think about the implications of remuneration in terms of risk management. I mean, I find it quite interesting when you look at a lot of executive remuneration packages, what they call the long-term incentives. It's actually like 3 years. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, you're not going to solve massive problems like climate change in 3 years. That's the kind of challenge. You need to be making really long-term investments. You need to be thinking 10-year plus horizons. And it's partly an issue that so short-termism is rife. And just if you look at CEO tenure, okay, there's I think the average CEO tenure is about 4 years. So that doesn't work very much in the favour of tackling big, meaty, long-run issues. So so one of the things that I've been looking at recently is this whole issue of having, what if we start imposing longer term payment of variable remuneration. Okay, so if you want to call it a bonus, I mean, it might not necessarily be cash, it could come in the form of shares or whatever. But if your variable remuneration, instead of it being paid on a yearly basis, what if it effectively gets put on ice for a number of years, or an extended time? And the idea would be that if during that vesting period, while you're waiting to get your reward, if it turns out that you've achieved these apparent wonderful results, by some inappropriate means. Okay, maybe you got it through cheating your customers, or maybe you got it because you took a lot of risk that wasn't obvious at the time and that only became obvious later on. So if it turns out that some of those things happen, then it gives the board the opportunity to withdraw some of the reward. So that sometimes the technical term for that is a malice clause. So this is what's being talked about as a possible direction, both for the senior executive, but not just for the senior executive, also for executives at middle ranking levels as well. And when you put that idea out there, a lot of what the typical response that you get, executives will say, "Oh, the sky's going to fall in. All the good people will leave. Okay, they will go to other industries, or they'll go to other jurisdictions where they don't, where they don't have that kind of arrangement. You'll never attract anyone good ever again." We've been exploring this a couple of ways, and I think last time I spoke to you about our accountability project, and that touched we touched on that area a little bit, but we've been doing some lab experiments recently. So we've done this now both with students and with professionals from the financial services industry. And so we get people to come into a lab environment, and the way the experiment is set up, they are going to get we get them to work. They actually have a few different tasks to perform in sequence. And they can actually, in the first sequence, we offer them variable reward with immediate payment. Okay. And so they'll get their cash. They're going to be compared to one another, and the people who can generate the most transactions in that window of time get more reward. And the other wrinkle in this experiment is that we also monitor whether they're behaving well, okay, or whether from a risk and compliance point of view. Okay, so we give them certain rules that they're supposed to follow, and we say, these are the rules. There are people observing you, but the audit rate's 20%. Okay, so if you misbehave, there's still a good chance that you won't get caught. And of course, that's how the real world operates. Okay, there's no perfect system of monitoring. Okay, compliance is always imperfect. So the way we've set up the experiment is there is this trade-off between good behavior and getting lots of transactions. Okay, and so we feel that's very reflective of a real world environment. So we do that, and then in the second work period, similar sort of thing, but this time we say, now your payment is going to be deferred. You won't get it till later. Okay, so we actually take down their bank account details and we send them the money sometime later. And the difference, of course, with the deferred structure is that we can have much better monitoring, okay? Because that reflects the idea that in the real world, normally over time, a lot of the bad stuff eventually comes out, if you've been misbehaving. And then in the third phase of the experiment, we give people the choice, okay? We say, okay, this time you can choose variable immediate, variable deferred, or if you want, you can have fixed pay. Okay, so we wanted to really take account of these self-selection effects that the industry is so worried about. Okay, that we're going to lose all the good people Okay.
And I always think it's funny when they say the implicit thing, and they're going to lose the good people, brackets
Like
like
me,
me,
yeah.
is always the sort of...
That's
I mean, I would never be in this industry, as failing to accept, of course, that there is a whole ton of other people that might be there. But sorry, do go on.
So anyway, we the unsurprising bit of the experiment is that, of course, with the deferred remuneration, people's behaviour was a lot better. Okay, so that was what you would predict. Okay, with better monitoring, more auditing of people's misbehaviour, they do tend to lift their game, and a lot of that stuff goes away. So I think we can be reasonably confident that, with a benefit of deferrals is that you're going to get better behaviour, you're going to get more of the bad risk taking, and the non-compliance will get picked up, and that does make a difference. Okay, so that was completely expected. But what surprised us a bit was in terms of the productivity, okay? Because it turned out that when we looked at the self-selection issue, like who chose to go into the deferred pool and who chose to go into the case of immediate payment, it turned out that the most productive ones were quite happy with the deferral. Okay, they were not overrepresented in the immediate payment category at all. Okay, now I probably should have added when I was explaining the experiment, we did offer a deferral premium. Okay, so we were saying, okay, if you're going to get a deferral, we'll give you a little bit extra to compensate you for the delay. So there was, and so what you find is that, sure, people differ in their time preferences. Okay, so some people, even if you offer a deferral premium, some people will still choose immediate payment. Okay, in other words, they're a bit more impatient. Okay, but as a general rule, you don't find the really productive people in that camp. And so we looked into it a little bit more, into the academic literature and what it says on this topic. And what we discovered was that, in fact, intelligence, cognitive ability, is linked to the ability to delay gratification more. Okay, so smarter people actually tend, on average, to be more patient. So a finance person would say they have lower discount rate for future payments. So what comes out of this is that, in fact, having more deferrals could be a favourable sorting mechanism to help attract smarter people. So that was it was kind of interesting. We discovered that. And then another thing, as I've reported these findings to people in the industry, I think another thing that people have talked about is the fact, well, look, if you're a really smart person, a very capable person, you probably want other people to know that, and you're happy to back yourself. You're willing to put yourself out there and come under greater scrutiny. Okay, what's the rush? Okay, provided you've got a sufficient fixed salary, to cover your living expenses, there are some benefits in thinking, well, I'm going to really prove beyond doubt that I'm good at this. I'm not relying on cheating. I'm not relying on doing silly risk taking, and that will be apparent in the fullness of time. So yeah, it kind of it really brought home that sometimes the long-term perspective, which I think is really important for risk governance, I don't think it's going to be such a problem as many people think.
Wow. That is absolutely. I mean, that's just it's nice to hear though, because it would fit the pattern of how we would like the world to be, and very often that's not. But that's really really interesting because I think when one back to my sort of little joke about like me is that obviously the reason you have those remuneration structures is in part to attract a certain type of person. You want the people to be motivated, incentivized. And so to your point, that is going to be self-selecting. And it was always occurred to me that banking attracts a certain type of person, and whisper it. There are lots of people in that industry who, if pay levels were more comparable with other industries, wouldn't be doing it. They'll claim otherwise, but there's there will be people that would do it. But there's a ton of people in that space because of and of course, we tend to think of that in quantum terms. But what you're talking about here is much more around the structure.
Yeah, that's right.
And the sort of setup of it. And I'm fascinated by the signaling that you just talked about, because I think that's really interesting. That's not something we would naturally think of. But actually, working in a highly paid industry does play into other people's perceptions of us and the whole masters of the universe type mentalities. So I think that's a really interesting angle on it.
So, yeah, look, I really hope directors, will be willing to step up, and because, I think too often directors, look, it's a human nature to be greedy, okay? So any executive who's negotiating their remuneration, they're going to try and get whatever they can and as quickly as possible, okay? That's just human nature. But I think we need directors that are willing to really negotiate a bit harder with executives, at that point of, recruitment. I think maybe part of the problem that we see with the recruitment of senior execs is that the way the whole recruiting process goes, like they'll appoint a headhunter and the headhunter will go out and maybe find, 2 or 3 candidates that the board meets, and then they've got like their preferred candidate. By the time you come to that point, the board has hardly any negotiating power. Okay, you've got, you've got so few, you just don't have a big enough pool to really, as in a negotiating, if you want to have a strong negotiating position, you have to be prepared to walk away. And often, I just don't think they're in a position to be able to do that. So maybe we really need to rethink the whole way that senior execs are recruited, and so that directors are a bit more empowered to get a better deal for shareholders and for other stakeholders.
And this is really fascinating to me because I look at the world through the human risk lens, right, which basically says people are a prime cause of things going wrong, either causing it in the first place or making it worse. And so I sort of started with that lens. And then I moved to the opposite end of the spectrum and said, well, actually, if we want to succeed, we need to get the best out of people. So what's the opposite of risk reward? So I came up with this idea of human rewards and getting the best out of people. And if you overcook the human risk thing, right, you minimize human reward. You don't get the best out of people because you're spending your whole time constraining them, particularly in the knowledge economy where you want them to be doing those things that are simultaneously getting the best out of human beings. So emotional intelligence, nuance, all those sorts of things machines can't do. But the flip side is if you unleash the human reward, you end up with this sort of do whatever it takes, just be yourself, be the best you can. And of course that causes risk. And what I like about what you've just articulated, this is a lovely way of pressing both buttons, because you're still maintaining that, look, go for it. And really, really, really drive this thing as hard as you can and work really hard. So driving the baby, but you're not doing it in a dangerous manner because you've bought that extra time. And I love this idea of just literally using time. It's putting a bit of friction into the process. Suddenly helps square that circle.
Yeah, that's right. And really, it comes back to this point. Risk outcomes just cannot be known in the short term. Okay. You're kidding yourself if you think otherwise. Okay, it's only in the passage of time that you find out, what really went on. Okay, and to what extent people were skimping on, on their systems, or were they taking a very short-sighted view of, the way they treat customers, all of those chickens will come home to roost eventually. Yeah. So yeah, and another thing that I was thinking about today, this whole idea of short-termism being a big problem for risk management. It's partly a function of public listed companies, and they're under all of these pressures to produce their quarterly earnings reports and everything. But there's a big trend going on in our society where a lot of public firms are being taken private, and I think one of the reasons for that is that people are very frustrated with all of this short-termism. One of the potential benefits of the private markets is that you can have a longer-term perspective. Okay, normally money's tied up for 10 years or more. And maybe there's something to be said for that. I mean, I do have some reservations about private equity and some of the incentives that are involved there, but I have to acknowledge that real positive.
That is fascinating. I could talk about this forever, but I want to shift you on to look at what I'll loosely term model risk, and it's something you focus on, and this. Which I think is another interesting driver of a lot of the challenges. And we have this, in some cases, blind faith in black boxes and models that are used. And we've seen this in banking, great example, where lots of faith was placed into things that, again, whisper it, some people didn't fully understand and weren't necessarily fit for purpose. I wanted to get your perspective on that.
Yeah. So quantitative risk modelling, it's one of those topics where people do tend to have strong views. I tend to think about it from. I tend to be a bit of I'm a fan of quantitative models from the point of view that I think they can really help to clarify things. They can give you a very clear perspective on what the of how risks might play out. We were talking earlier about how can you communicate risk effectively, and sometimes having those risk models can be a wonderful communication tool. So let me give you an example. I love Monte Carlo simulation as an example. So that being able to just have to show, you can literally see the risk. You can say, well, here's an exchange rate, and there's, here are 10,000 possible paths for what could happen over the next year. Okay, and you can literally observe that and then say, well, what would be the implications of that for our earnings and blah, blah, blah. And the nice thing there is not only can you visualize it very graphically, thereby making the risk salient, but the assumptions are concrete, okay? And they're very clearly laid out and they can be debated, okay? And the problem I have, if you don't have a quantitative model, then, people will still create their mental models, okay, for thinking about risk. Don't fool yourself that you can avoid having a model. It's just, the thing is, the model is in their head and you can't see what assumptions they're making, okay? So the model, I think, is great if you can use it in such a way as to get people involved and thinking about what the model means. And of course, very importantly, debating the problems of the model, okay? Because there is no perfect model. And, so the only way to work well with models is to have plenty of discussion about the weaknesses of the model and what are the implications of that. So you want a mod. That's the way I teach. So I spend a lot of time trying to get people to use a model as a jumping off point for a discussion and getting then you can bring in all your overlays of, expert opinion. So I'm not saying that you rely solely on the model, but rather that it's an input to the decision. And without that, I think we'd be way worse off. We would then be completely at the mercy of those biases, and we already know how badly that works out. Okay, so without a model, I just think we'd be worse. Now, it's certainly true some risks are much more, are not as amenable for modelling. And that I acknowledge that, and then that's when we have to start getting into a lot of this more subjective scenario, thinking through possible scenarios. Okay, so you have to rely more on your expert knowledge. But I think one of the benefits of working with models is it does help people develop skills in probabilistic thinking. Okay, something like foreign exchange risk, it's very amenable to quantitative modelling, and I do that with my students quite a bit. And I think just going through that process of thinking about, there's 10% probability of this scenario, it just helps train people in that way of thinking, and that is a skill that is really enormously helpful in projecting into future worlds. Have you ever come across the Good Judgment Project? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So look, forecasting in those low validity domains is incredibly tough. But one of the features of, the better forecasters, the people that have that good judgment, they do tend to be people that are good at probabilistic thinking. So I think it's really a skill that is worth developing. And so I, much to my students' horror at times, I do continue to require them to do some of that statistical modelling. I just don't see how you can be serious about risk management without having that in your toolkit. Yeah.
And I'll put a link to that in the show notes for listeners that haven't come across that before.
Yeah.
But I think this is really fascinating because the model narrative has tended to sort of go one way or the other, which is you've got people that will read stick solid. The model's told us this, so we need to do it. No thinking for themselves. Or the opposite, which is, well, they're all rubbish, right? Can't rely on these things. They're useless. And you can see that with the COVID narrative. And clearly the truth is somewhere between the two, but I like the way you talked about it there as almost a sort of framing of the discussion. So we need to start somewhere. And if we don't have something that's based around data, we're going to be starting about the data that's in our heads, which, as you point out, comes from interesting places that may not necessarily be valid, and brings us back to some of those other drivers. So I think this is a really interesting, and I like the fact again that you're helping square lots of circles in my mind, which is a great thing. Which is sort of, how do we cope with the fact these things exist? We're using them. There's reliance that's placed on them. So what we need to do is balance that out by saying they're there, they serve a purpose, but let's not assume that they always have the right answer. And we get there. And I think that point you made around you have to understand what it's doing, incredibly valid, because otherwise it does become this black box that spits out an answer. A little bit like the Wizard of Oz. You have to look behind the curtain to know what's going on.
That's right. I mean, there's the wonderful analogy. I didn't come up with this, by the way. I can't remember who I got it from, but the idea of the use of sat navs. Okay, so death by death. There are people that have died from using their sat nav, okay, who have literally just blindly followed the sat nav off a cliff, okay, and they just haven't switched their brains on to really question, is this machine really telling me something sensible? Okay, so we always, no matter what technology we use, you've always got to question it. Yeah. So
right, data is of course one thing. The other thing that we rely heavily on when we think about things is anecdotes. and sort of what's going on in the real world. And storytelling is obviously a key component in terms of how we understand the world, but also how, I'm always struck that childhood, how is risk management communicated at a young age? Well, we're told stories about things that have happened. And I love the fact that in the book, you did that. You went there, and it's not just theory. I said to you before we started recording, this isn't just a book that sits on the academic shelf. It's very interesting. You go through some real life examples. And I wondered how you'd gone about picking those. I mean, there's clearly tons out there, but what you've done, I think, is picked some really good ones that are comprehensible enough to the average person, but also really resonate in terms of the impact. How did you think about picking those?
So I intentionally chose cases from the last 5 years because, I mean, there's lots of oldies but goodies, but, there's, in most of those cases, there's plenty of resources there. I also wanted to pick up cases from a couple of different industries and geographies. So I'm hoping that this is not going to be a book just for Australians, but will be relevant to...
So this is perfect. This is a good example of risk management, right? So you've dealt with the fact that people say, well, that's from ages ago, so it's not relevant. You've dealt with the fact that it's not just one specific industry, right? I like this is very smart. And you're thinking, well, I don't want people saying this is just an Australian view of the world. Because So superb risk management in writing the book.
Diversification, yes. So I chose the Commonwealth Bank case study, which is a wonderful case study because there's just, there's rich resources and it's local for me. So I teach that case and students find it wonderful.
Yeah, that would be remiss of you not to have included that one because it is a sort of poster child for this sort of subject.
And what I do, because we had that Royal Commission a couple of years ago. And one of the really nice things about that is that, so we've got all the video footage of the chairman of the board, Catherine Livingstone, and the CEO, Matt Common, being grilled at the commission. And so I loved it. It's like playing that video in class. I mean, students are absolutely transfixed. It just brings the whole topic to life to such an extent. And there's a lot of good stuff in that case. It really gets to some ethical issues. So the idea is like speaking up. Okay, so one of the interesting things in that case is how Matt Coman. So he's the CEO now, but he was previously the head of the retail bank, and he was worried about some of these practices, and he did go to the then CEO to express his concerns, and the then CEO told him that he should temper his sense of justice. And I think it's a great case that deals with a lot of these issues of speaking up. Okay, and what do you do when the environment's not very conducive to speaking up? So there's some really good meaty issues there. We do I included Dieselgate, so that just got into my 5-year window.
So this is the VW case. Yeah,
VW, and that they were, the executives were, the engineers put in place these defeat devices so that they could get through the American regulations falsely, but then as soon as the cars were on the open road, they were emitting like crazy. So, and then that all fell apart badly. So that brings out some interesting issues about culture of the organisation, about you've got that whole interesting issue that German companies have, that supervisory board. They had some, brings out issues to do with block holders and to what extent these block holders doing a good job at scrutinising what the executive's doing. That kind of, so there's lots in that. I've got a chapter on climate risk, which you've got to have that. I've got a chapter on cyber, and within that goes through a number of the recent cyber cases. And so they're all things that seem to me to be interesting, that, they all bring out interesting governance issues and risk management issues. So I really hope, so that people find that, that it helps to bring what could be quite a dry topic to life. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of, if you want to take a dry angle on this subject, there are plenty of books available. So I was delighted that you hadn't gone for that. And I think that you should just tell us a little bit about the cover, because I love that. Because one, it sort of brilliantly makes the point.
Yeah. So the cover image is of a really big shark. I think it could be a white pointer, I'm not sure. And you've got some divers in obviously filming the shark, but they're in this massive steel cage, and the bars are really thick. So obviously it's a metaphor for the idea that you can take huge risks, like swimming with sharks, provided you're well protected. Okay, and I think that's one of the common misunderstandings that people have about risk management, that it's all totally defensive and let's never take a risk. No, good risk managers are trying to find ways of taking risk acceptably. Okay, I guess also, the shark. Another reason for the shark image, obviously, there's an Australian connection. We're well known for having dangerous waters around here.
It's not just the waters that are dangerous in Australia. I mean, I'm not talking about the human animal. The other animals are also going to be dangerous. Yeah.
But the other thing is, I just think the shark it's an image that also brings out the whole issue of dread risk. Okay, so how there are mostly. The problem we have with risk management is that we're too apathetic and overconfident, but there's just a few of these special risks, and sharks is a great example where people actually are over the top scared, and English people coming to swim on Australian beaches are completely over the top. I mean, I am an ocean swimmer, and I swim with sharks, not big ones like that, but little ones. And if you once you really understand the probabilities, it's. Do you know which animal causes the most deaths in Australia?
I'm guessing human beings, probably, but no.
No, but not a non-human animal.
No idea.
The horse. More people die in horse riding accidents than from all the other stuff, the snakes, the spiders, the sharks, all that. And I would like to point out to you that you've probably got more horses in England than what we do.
This is probably true. I should be on the lookout now for that particular risk. That's fascinating. I love that. And look, as if writing one book weren't enough to keep you occupied, you've also contributed to another book which looks at things from an auditing perspective. And I wanted to make sure I explore that as well, because as long-term listeners of the show will know, there's a little bit of a theme that I occasionally do often, which is people often think of auditors as sort of checking, we're here to check on other people, but actually in many respects, they drive some of the pieces, because audit recommendations come with a tremendous amount of power. And I've seen in my time lots of audit recommendations that aren't necessarily as intelligent as they could be, and actually rather than mitigating risk, cause problems. So I was fascinated when I saw that you were writing in relation to auditing this. I thought this is a really interesting topic. So what's all that about? What's the idea here?
Okay, so once again, that project came out of some of the scandals in Australia's banks a few years ago, and particularly the Commonwealth Bank case, that the internal audit function had been raising red flags. Okay, so there were a number of serious audit findings, but they were ignored. They were not listened to. And so the internal audit profession here in Australia, I think, is really working hard to try and address to build capability and to build not just the technical skills but influencing skills, so that they can be a much more powerful voice in the organisation. So I was honoured to be invited onto a committee working on that issue, and out of then it was decided, well, we really need to build up capability for auditors to assess risk culture. Okay, so the directors have this responsibility that they are supposed to monitor the risk culture. They're supposed to form a view on the risk culture of the organisation. How can you possibly do that if you're a non-executive director? It's quite a dilemma. How can you get that information? So I think that internal audit can play a role in that process and should. So they're going about their work. They're moving around the organisation, and I think if we can build up their capability, they can be observing behaviour. They might also do things like they could also run surveys or things like that. But we wanted to give them a good understanding of what is risk culture, what does good look like? Okay, what are the important dimensions of risk culture that you need to be looking out for as you go about your work? Okay, and to be able to include in their audit reports some discussion about their observations of the culture. And I think it's uncomfortable territory for a lot of auditors, because most of them have been trained as accountants. They've never been taught those concepts. Yeah, so we have created that resource. My co-authors were wonderful. Elizabeth Arzadon, I think many people in the UK know her. So she's got some UK experience. She's got regulatory experience. She was in one of the major banks in the UK for a time. And we had another, Reg Dupree's. He's at one of the super funds here in Australia. So it was a great collaboration to put that together, and that is freely available. If anyone wants to download that I'm sure Christian will make a link, but it's freely available on the Institute of Internal Auditors website here in Australia. And the other thing to mention is that my university, Macquarie University, has decided to make freely available our risk culture scale, this was developed. It was a big research project that we did several years ago, and I think it would be good if it was more available for people in the industry, for people to use it internally to assess their own culture. So it's an employee survey. Don't mean to suggest that surveys are the only way of assessing culture. I'm not saying that at all, but I think properly done, they can play a role. So if people are interested in exploring that, you can certainly drop me an email and I can help you get access to that tool.
Fascinating. Wow. And look, I think that's fantastic. And one of the reasons I love speaking to you is that you are clearly not just interested in this subject and have a passion for it yourselves, but you're also committed to really driving through change. So this isn't some sort of academic study. It really is around how can we improve things. I will, as you say, put a link to all those things in the show notes. But I love this idea of equipping auditors with what I think is a really important toolkit for them to be able to actually do their job properly. And I don't mean that they're not doing it properly, but we've never necessarily historically defined it in those terms. And a lot of auditing is just, does a control exist? Yes, no. And that's important. Let's be very clear about that. But equally, and you find some interesting things out with that as well. But there comes a stage where, back to my sort of introductory point, is you could make a recommendation that was theoretically perfect, but practically flawed, that didn't understand these human components that are there. And then the second bit is the point you made around, we actually need to suss out the culture, because we can have particularly back to the earlier comments about changing environment. And we need to be thinking about sort of the spirit of the law, if you like, as much as the letter. And you don't get that if you're just focusing. So I love this idea of sort of saying, look, we're going to take you to a territory that you might not have been trained in, that might not feel comfortable, but is absolutely key to where you're at. And so I almost saw a little bit like you talking about taking your students into a zone that might make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. I think this is also a very powerful example of where we need to stretch people's skill sets to be able to solve the challenges that are facing us. Yeah.
Well, I'll be very interested. I'd love to hear people's feedback on that guide. So I think it's called Auditing Risk Culture, a practical guide. So I'd love to hear what people think of that. Please.
And of course, all the non-auditors are giggling about the words audit and practical in the same sentence. But we'll park that. Elizabeth, as ever, time with you has just flown, and we've covered a ton of topics. And I've learned a lot, so I know that my listeners hopefully will also learn some things. The book comes highly recommended, as do all the other things that you put out, because I think, as people will have recognized, there's a very human component to what you do, and there's a real energy and vibe about what you do, and I think a wonderful intellectual curiosity that's just come across with every single conversation. So thank you, one, for all the work you do. Secondly, and probably from my perspective, more importantly, thank you for coming on a third time. I would love it if there were a fourth time for you to come on. So we'll have to gratuitously find an excuse for that to happen. But thank you so much.
Okay, and thanks to you, Christian. It's just so enjoyable for me to be part of this community that you've created, and I love listening to the podcasts that you create and hearing what all the other speakers have to say.
Amazing. Thank you. So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Elizabeth for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about her books, Risk Governance, Biases, Blindspots and Bonuses, and Auditing Risk Culture, a Practical Guide, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those there. There are also links to Elizabeth's previous appearances on the show in case you missed them or want to listen to them again. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it on whichever platform you're using, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about human risk, the work that I do with my clients, the Human Risk newsletter, video blog and blog, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.